The Terrifying Fire, a story of survival in the countryside. It was the fall of 1994, and the countryside of New Hope, a small village tucked in the hills of Pennsylvania, was a tranquil place. For Sarah Matthews and her younger brother Ethan, life in the countryside meant peace and simplicity. They cherished their quiet rural existence, tending to their farm animals and growing their own food. But one evening that peace was shattered. It was a Wednesday, November 8th, when everything changed. Sarah had just returned from the market with fresh produce. Ethan had gone to help their father, James Matthews, with some repairs to the barn. Their mother, Margaret, was baking in the kitchen, filling the house with the comforting scent of cinnamon rolls. The evening had an almost perfect stillness, the only sound being the occasional wind rustling the trees outside. As the night began to settle in, Sarah was in the living room when she noticed a faint, acrid smell, something like burning wood. At first, she assumed it was just the remnants of a nearby campfire, as there were others in the village who often gathered for warmth around small fires. However, as she walked closer to the kitchen, the smell grew stronger. Her heart began to race. She turned toward the back door, where she could see a faint glow flickering in the distance. Her worst fears were confirmed as she stepped out into the cool night air. The barn, where her father and brother were working, was on fire. Sarah screamed for Ethan and her father, her voice breaking through the eerie silence of the night. Ethan and James were still in the barn when the fire erupted. They were caught completely off guard. The old barn, which had been standing for over 50 years, was made of dry timber, and it quickly became an inferno. Ethan, who had been working near the hayloft, barely had time to react before the fire reached him. His father, seeing the danger, rushed to him, shouting for him to get out. The fire spread so quickly that Sarah, standing helplessly at a distance, could only watch in horror. She felt paralyzed, as if the air around her had thickened, making it hard to breathe. The entire barn was engulfed, and within minutes the flames reached the surrounding trees, threatening to spread further. Sarah ran to the house, shouting for her mother to call the fire department. In that moment, panic consumed her. She barely noticed the smoke that had begun to pour from the barn toward the house. She grabbed the phone and dialed 911, but there was no signal. The nearest fire station was miles away, and the response time would be agonizingly slow. There was nothing she could do but wait. Ethan and James had suffered severe burns, and they were both disoriented, unable to move quickly. Sarah, in a panic, grabbed a blanket and ran toward the barn. She could feel the intense heat from the flames even from a distance. She found her father leaning against a tree, his face covered in soot and ash, and Ethan lying on the ground, barely conscious. With sheer determination, Sarah helped her father lift Ethan, her strength running on pure adrenaline. They stumbled toward the house, but the fire was spreading fast. As they neared the front door, the heat was unbearable. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of sirens, but it seemed so far away. The fire, now a roaring monster, had swallowed the barn completely and was inching toward the rest of the property. Sarah knew they didn't have much time. As she got them into the house, Sarah managed to lock the doors and close the windows, but the smoke was starting to seep in. She quickly grabbed a wet cloth and tied it around her mouth, hoping it would help protect her from the toxic smoke that was filling the air. In a panic, Sarah tried calling the fire department again, but the phone line had been cut. The heat was unbearable, and Sarah knew they couldn't stay inside much longer. She had to get her family to safety. Just as the fire reached the edge of their property, the sound of sirens grew louder. Help had finally arrived. The fire department from New Hope, along with volunteers from nearby towns, rushed to the scene. The firefighters worked tirelessly to contain the blaze, but the barn, several acres of farmland, and a nearby forest had already been reduced to ash. After what felt like hours, the fire was under control, but the damage was devastating. Sarah, Ethan, and James were rushed to the hospital. Ethan had second-degree burns on his arms and face, while James had third-degree burns on much of his body. Both were in critical condition. Sarah, though covered in soot, had only minor burns and smoke inhalation. It took weeks for the family to recover. Ethan had to undergo several surgeries, and James was in the hospital for months fighting infection after infection. The fire had claimed everything, almost everything. The barn, their livestock, and many of their belongings were gone, leaving them with little more than the clothes on their backs. Sarah's strength and determination had saved her family, but the scars of that night would remain with them forever. The fire was later determined to have been caused by an electrical fault in the old barn. The Matthews family would rebuild, but they would never forget the terror of that night, the night that changed everything. The fire of November 8, 1994, left its mark on New Hope. For years afterward, the townspeople would talk about it in hushed tones, remembering how quickly the flames had spread and how lucky the Matthews family was to escape. But Sarah, Ethan, and James Matthews knew the true cost of that night. Their lives had been spared, but at a heavy price.